Tēnā tātou. Ko te paki pūmeka nei, hei kaupapa I waihangatia e Webb's rāua ko BNZ, hei kaupapa kōrero mo te kohinga toi a te pēki o Aotearoa. Ko ia nei ko te kohinga toi a te pēki o Aotearoa. Ki katoa tēnei kohinga toi I ngā toi a ngā tōhunga tā whakāhua rongonui rau atu I Aotearoa. Pēnei ia Colin McCahon, a Rita Angus, a Evelyn Page, rātou ko Gordon Walters. I whakaemitia ngā toi nei I roto I ngā tau ko 1980. Ko te whakātu I te huhua me te topanga a ngā toi a tātai I roto I Aotearoa, te kaupapa matua I taua wā. The Bank of New Zealand Art Collection is a cultural treasure trove. It holds works by many of the nation's leading artists, including Colin McCahon, Rita Angus, Evelyn Page and Gordon Walters. Assembled in the heady days of the early and mid-1980s, the collection captures an illuminating cross-section of New Zealand visual art of the time.
Yes, the collection is not only paintings in the traditional sense. In fact, it is very broad. Paintings, print works, pottery.
The BNZ Art Collection is really one of the most sophisticated corporate collections this country's ever seen. It was put together at a time when corporate collecting was a bit of a thing. There were a number of large corporations that were building art collections. But BNZ is really distinguished by the attention to detail that they put into building their collection.
What's really interesting about the collection is that it really is a snapshot of who we were as New Zealanders at that time.
What was interesting about seeing the collection in situ was realising that it wasn't an investment collection, it was a furnishing collection, and Peter McLeavey had put together this collection so that people who worked in the BNZ and clients at the BNZ would be exposed to art. And it was interesting seeing the work installed in offices as well as public spaces. And you realise that he was trying to test out people's sympathy and engagement for contemporary art.
This is a collection that sits between public and private, although it is a corporate collection and it's been held as a private collection. There's been a generosity of spirit with the BNZ to share the works with the public.
How does BNZ share its collection with people that don't work for the bank?
The BNZ collection is not just for BNZ. It's for the citizens of Wellington, and indeed it's for our nation. It is not just a BNZ feature. It is for anybody and everybody that wishes to take the trouble to have a look.
It's my very great pleasure to take people on a tour of the Bank of New Zealand collection, and it enabled me to take people around the collection in the private banking chamber, and it was a real revelation for people to see what was there because the standard of the work was just so remarkable, all of them like public gallery pieces, and yet here they were all together in one room, cheek by jowl, just amazing masterpieces, all of them.
This period, before the economic shock that followed the October 1987 stock market crash, was a time of affluence. With private and corporate collectors enjoying their wealth and engaging in acquiring New Zealand art, the art scene rapidly developed. Dealer galleries proliferated, artists prospered, and collections bloomed. The Bank of New Zealand was at the forefront of private collecting at the time, building one of the largest and most esteemed corporate collections in the country. The depth and breadth of the collection and the quality of the work it contains have ensured that it has retained artistic significance and cultural mana in the decades since it was compiled. The BNZ Art Collection was assembled under the stewardship of distinguished art dealer Peter McLeavey. It has impressive breadth, encompassing photography, printmaking, painting and sculpture. These works are bound together by key threads which appear throughout the collection. A keen interest in the New Zealand landscape is reflected in works by Leo Benseman, Toss Wollaston, Brent Wong and Lawrence Aberhart. The international language of abstraction is spoken by Gretchen Albrecht, Milan Merkosic and Stephen Banbury. Feminist considerations can be found in the 1980s photography by artists such as Megan Jenkinson and Fiona Partington. echoing the representation of pioneering women artists such as Lois White and Adele Younghusband. These threads were woven into the fabric of the 1980s New Zealand art scene, and today mark the key concerns of New Zealand artists working in the mid to late 20th century. Peter McLeavey has gone down in history as one of New Zealand's most important art dealers. He was an instrumental part of developing a market for modern and contemporary New Zealand art, starting out showing art in his apartment bedroom in central Wellington in 1966. He established a gallery at 147 Cuba Street in 1968 and continued to operate there until 2011, when he passed the reins to his daughter, Olivia McLeavey.
The McLeavey Gallery was one of my regular visiting places. I bought a few paintings from the gallery. I remember him taking me to his house in order to show me his poetry collection. I remember Geoffrey Harris and Ian Scott were there. I think they were staying with him, and huge Walters and McCahons on the walls and things. It was an unforgettable experience.
In 1982, Peter McLeavey was offered the role of art advisor at Bank of New Zealand. He seemed to immediately grasp the importance of such a role. "It is a very big job," he ruminated in a letter to Toss Wollaston, "and I have to give it a lot of thought. I feel almost a social responsibility to take it." Even at the genesis of the BNZ art collection, McLeavey foresaw its significance and its potential contribution to the development of New Zealand art.
I think putting the collection together was really important for Peter McLeavey. It was a very hard life as a dealer. Sometimes you have a sellout show and then sometimes you can't sell work for months. But working for the BNZ gave him this regular income, which I think he was extremely grateful for. And he took the responsibility of putting the collection together very seriously.
I think the collection is a great credit to Peter. He wasn't just functioning in terms of maybe his more personal interests that are expressed within the gallery context, his gallery context. He was thinking about it in a much bigger way, I think, in a national context, and that allowed him to admit things into that would not fit so readily into his gallery project. That shows you something of the size of Peter as a person, his generosity and his intelligence.
He didn't just buy from himself. He actually spent a lot of time going around and looking at shows in other galleries and spent the money, spread it around. Thought that was part of his responsibility as the person putting together that collection.
I think he really put those needs in front of other things. In the hands of someone else, it could have been an agenda that, got hijacked.
The works acquired by the Bank of New Zealand throughout the 1980s today constitute one of the most remarkable and esteemed corporate collections in New Zealand art.
Another major figure in the collection is Tony Thompson, an artist that McLeavey greatly admired but never worked with. The gallery, Yana Land Gallery, that Thompson showed with was just downstairs from McLeavey, so you could very well imagine him wandering into the exhibitions and taking a look at the works.
Quality is really what drove Peter's convictions about what needed to go into that collection, and I think that's a great credit to him.
He had an eye for artists who were good but not fashionable. Leo Benjamin is a good example. That he should have picked up those Benjamin paintings showed that he had a genuine eye for quality. He wasn't subject to fashion excessively.
Peter McLeavey's name is one that comes up a lot within the provenance of the works in this collection. He's a figure within the New Zealand art scene that was instrumental to really building an art market here. I never met Peter, but I have heard that he was a character, and I think for a dealer to be successful, their personality and passion for art is really what carries that through.
I was pretty moved at the quality of many of the pieces that I saw represented. I feel represented well. The McCahons are fantastic. I was speaking very positively about John Reynolds' work and other people, that the Merkazich, there's some incredibly important first-rate work there. That's the thing. That wouldn't be the case without Peter.
There are other artists that I think he did a lot to pull them out of obscurity and give recognition to them. I'm thinking of people like Charles Toll, the Auckland painter, or Lois White. He recognised their quality and exhibited them or purchased them for the BNZ collection, and I think that he was quite important in sort of finessing art history by his ability to pick talent even when it wasn't fashionable.
The decision of McLeavey and his BNZ colleagues to focus on contemporary art has resulted in a collection that serves as a time capsule for the New Zealand art scene of the 1980s, an exciting moment in this country's art history. Local artists were bolstered by the market and their career prospects broadened considerably.
McLeavey and the artist he showed, it's interesting because what you see now as highly prized on the secondary market, it was basically, that was his exhibition calendar. You know, so the artists that are now selling for big sums and are very highly sought after, Colin McCahon, you know, Hanley, Gordon Walters, Don Binney, these were all artists he showed.
One guiding principle established by McLeavey at the outset of the BNZ art collection was that it should reflect New Zealand identity. This manifests itself differently in each artwork in the collection, which vary in medium, date of production, subject matter and style. But this overarching principle ensures that the collection is unified by its focus on New Zealand identity, telling New Zealand stories, championing New Zealand artists, and responding to the specific experience of this extraordinary place. New Zealand art has a deep and rich history. Many gifted artists have brought their unique talents to the cultural story of Aotearoa, and each of them is worthy of admiration. But there is one artist whose fame towers above all others: Colin McCahon. McCahon was a force of nature. He painted with a drive and vigour probably unmatched by anyone before or since. His paintings were often stark, visually understated or restrained. Yet they captured something authentic and remarkable about the land, the social fabric, and the cultural psyche of New Zealand in the 20th century. More than anyone else, McCahon is responsible for creating a language of modern art distinct to Aotearoa. McCahon was enormously influential on his artistic peers. Regardless of whether they loved him or loathed him, his presence and the gravitas of his work affected art makers throughout the nation.
Whether you loved the work or hated it, you couldn't get around the fact that he was a towering figure in the New Zealand art scene of that time. There's no question about that.
You know, there's a kind of a regionalist McCahon, there's a kind of an internationalist McCahon, there's a pre-modernist McCahon, a kind of primitivist McCahon, there's a modernist McCahon, and there's a postmodernist McCahon. You know, everybody who was talking about New Zealand art from all sorts of different perspectives could make use of McCahon. And he was sort of like so high you couldn't get over him, so low you couldn't get under him, so wide you couldn't get around him.
He talks about his wall, he talks about Mondrian, he talks about Mondrian as the wall to get through, and so on and so forth. For me, I don't mean in a competitive sense, and I don't mean in any grandiose sense about myself, but he's a wall for anyone who wants to pick up a paintbrush in this country. McCahon's the wall.
Books were beginning to appear about New Zealand art. When I first got interested in the subject, there were no books whatever. So even to see works by people like Colin McCahon was quite difficult. By the 80s, that had all changed, and there was a lively literature about the arts as well as the arts themselves.
To have the opportunity to work with such a collection like the BNZ that has so many significant works by McCahon is a treat for the team here. It's a rare thing to have so many works all at once by such an iconic artist.
Works in the collection really traverse a really wide gamut of his career. So there is the kauri painting, which depicts where McCahon lived in Titirangi. Even at the time, that was quite a highly sought after work. They bought that at auction actually at Webb's for $40,000 in the early 80s. So a big price back then.
He should never have occurred in this culture. It's extraordinary. I was told by experts overseas, you will never have genius break out in this country. This is the guy from Lisson Gallery. The country's too small for genius to occur. Well, it did.
3 works in this collection stand out in particular. Kauri, painted in 1953, Oh Let Us Weep, from 1969, and Is There Anything of Which One Can Say, Look, This Is New? This remarkable 1982 work was one of McCahon's final 4 paintings.
The amazing thing about McLeavey's close relationship with McCahon was that he managed to secure one of the 4 last paintings McCahon ever did for the collection, an enormously significant work which used to always hang over the stair in the Bank of New Zealand building in Shortland Street and just knock people out when they saw it. The other work that was bought at the same time was bought by Jenny Gibbs for $100,000, which seemed an enormous price at the time. And people wrote articles about it, and astonished by the expense and so on. And yet now $100,000 spent in 1987 seems like a very good investment.
McLeavey was still his dealer, and so he had access to Colin's, there were plenty of McCahons in the stockroom, so to speak. McLeavey was in a privileged position to be able to choose strong works by McCahon for the BNZ collection, and my sense of it is that he tried to cover the field, as it were, to represent Colin's career as broadly as possible. The 8 works in the collection range from 1947 to 1982, which is a very large proportion of Colin's active career.
He died in May of 1987, but Wystan Curnow had put him into a show as part of the Sydney Biennale, I Will Need Words, in 1984, and yet that was after the period in which he'd pretty much stopped painting. That was kind of ending in 1982.
In 1993, McLeavey was asked to advise on the possible sale of McCahon's Is There Anything of Which One Can Say, Look, This Is New? And he cautioned strongly against it. It is one of the cornerstones of the Bank of New Zealand art collection, he wrote. Much prestige flows to the bank from this one object.
Being in the presence of a painting like this is something quite special.
It's often claimed that these paintings represent Colin's loss of faith at the end of his life and his own personal despair. I dispute that reading of his work. I think it makes much more sense to look at his last work as a kind of dialogue between the New Testament and the Old, between the despair of Ecclesiastes and the faith and hope of St. Paul.
It was in the last exhibition that he had at Peter McLeavey Gallery, and you can really see a shift there from almost the optimism of some of the works in the 1970s to someone really grappling with what it meant to be human and what it meant to exist on this earth and be conscious.
One of the structural features of those last paintings is a dotted line, horizontal and vertical, which divides up the panel, which is of course the T cross that is so dominant in Colin's later work. So I think that there is a kind of surreptitious, redemptive suggestion of Christianity buried in the despairing comments of the Old Testament prophet.
The body of work at its highest levels that McCahon put together can cut the mustard anywhere. I've stood there in Germany and I watched people with McCahon paintings, and you could see the magnetism towards them. Who is this? What is this? Why don't we know about this? Why is it so expensive? There's just no question in my mind how important the best of his work is.
The BNZ art collection covers a compelling breadth and depth of New Zealand's artistic output up to the 1980s. Of course, it includes works by established and renowned artists of the time, heavyweights in the story of New Zealand art. Though the collection also included works from young and emerging artists of the day. On account of this, BNZ amassed a collection of historical weight, but it also fostered the careers of young artists at the time.
I think the BNZ collection was certainly on the radar of a lot of contemporary artists, and they wanted to be in the Bank of New Zealand collection. First of all, they wanted to be in Peter McLeavey's stable. Julian Dashper, John Reynolds were showing with him, and they wanted to be in those important corporate collections.
Getting your work collected by the Auckland City Gallery or National or Te Papa or whatever, these things signified a certain value of your work. I don't mean in monetary terms, but an appreciation of the work's value. So in that sense, these collections became important ways of helping validate artists in a culture which didn't give them a lot of validation most of the time.
For an artist to be included in the BNZ collection was a coup. It was regarded as an achievement. If Peter McLeavey chose your work for the BNZ collection, that was a feather in your cap.
In the 1980s, artists had sort of a new opportunity to practice their art, full time. They didn't have to rely on, side hustles for income, because they were getting that income from their galleries.
What that means for art from that time is that it was really starting to blossom and diversify. Earlier generations of artists really had to have something else to support themselves, so a lot of them worked as teachers or they had office jobs.
People like Toss Williston, when he was in the West Coast, he had to work as a full-time Rawleys salesman selling healthcare products to sustain his living, and then he had to sort of find spare time to capture the landscape around him.
Alongside the contemporary works, throughout the 1980s, the collection also grew to represent earlier developments in New Zealand art.
Toll I think is a remarkable painter and is gradually developing a reputation and a place in the market, so to speak. I think he's a painter which is overdue for some sort of a survey, because I'm sure not very many people are familiar with his work.
What I really appreciate about the collection is the representation of plenty of New Zealand's most talented women artists. Figures like Evelyn Page, Rita Angus, Robin White, Fiona Partington, Gretchen Albrecht, the list really does go on, and it's great to see their recognition not only today but also way back in the 1980s.
Evelyn Page's career spanned 7 decades. She worked as a professional artist, which was rare for a woman of her time. Mostly her income came from selling portraits of people and landscape works, and that funded the works where she was being a bit more experimental.
The work behind me, a water series by Louise Henderson, is a great example of her work in the 1960s. She was dealing with the death of her husband and moving away from the Cubist style that had largely dominated her work.
Peter McLeavey explained his desire to explore the bank's historical roots, reflected in the acquisition of mid-late 19th century paintings of the New Zealand landscape by Nicholas Chevalier and Charles Blomfield. Though these paintings differ visually and contextually from the majority of the collection, they represent the dawn of New Zealand art history. Altogether, the BNZ art collection covers a wide range of significant artists. Many of the works were hand-picked by McLeavey as prime examples, capturing the best of the collected artists' output.
So for a long time, McLeavey had represented the artist Robin White. Even when she went to Kiribati, he was tremendously supportive of the change in direction for her. And, you know, he wrote to her obviously about the importance of her work and how its time would come. Soon the tide will turn, he said. But the work that he purchased for the BNZ art collection, in fact, is one of what he would call an icon of place. So it's a rural view of one of her friends stood in front of a railway goods shed, and it's a very typical Robin White, something that people would instantly recognise and relate to as being very much part of New Zealand culture and in fact part of the New Zealand vernacular.
There's this classic postmodern work in the collection called Russian Cruise Ship Princess Wharf. It's from 1987, and Dash started off by making this painting of kind of enlarged smither pebbles, you know, from a classic smither painting, and then over the top of it he painted this geometric abstraction and this kind of one idea with another idea blotting it out.
There is a fantastic Milan Mirkosic painting in there, golden centre with two elements. It is one of his best paintings. I think it's reasonable to say that. One of the things that really stands out to me about the strength of this work is that it has both that precision and that kind of expressive kind of quality to it.
We recognise all the big names like Wollaston and McCahon and Claremont and Thomason and so on, but there are quite idiosyncratic little moments in the collection as well. I think he's got a very beautiful eye, McLeavey, and he chose a really fantastic Helen Stewart work, sort of rural scene, and you know there's delightful works by Hariata Ropata Tangaho, and he was very supportive of women artists.
It's not just the expected names, you know. Of course the expected names are there, and there are great examples of their work, the Hoteries and the Hanleys. But to have a sprinkling of lesser known figures gives a kind of distinctiveness and idiosyncrasy to the collection, which I think is a really valuable part of it.
Works from the collection have featured in landmark exhibitions, speaking to their significance to New Zealand art history.
The Bank of New Zealand has always been amazingly generous about loaning its work, so it's had, you know, big exhibitions of the collection at City Gallery and so on. So it really was important for artists to make their way into these public collections and to have their work seen.
There's a lot of collections that get put together as what I call all sorts collections, like Licorice All Sorts. They're not so much collections of art, they're collections of names, and the BNZ collection wasn't a collection of names, it was a collection of work. And that's a big difference, it's a fundamental difference, and it's something that a lot of people who regard themselves as collectors today perhaps could just stop and think about a little bit. Don't collect names, collect works.
As a storehouse of cultural riches, the BNZ art collection has had a significant role in the development of Aotearoa's art history. It played a part in forging the careers of young artists of the day and in cementing the status of established artists. It is widely understood as the most important corporate collection in New Zealand.
This collection has been enormously important, I think, not only for artists who've had the opportunity to be in it and have had their work introduced to a really wide audience as a result, but also I think it's been important in terms of that really concentrated collecting that McLeavey did in the 1980s. So we've got this fantastic snapshot of what was going on in the art scene, which is unlike any other collection.
It was certainly one of the more prominent of the public collections, which was such a feature of the time. And of course, all these years later, it's beginning to aerate the general culture as these collections are broken up and bought by other people. And so I think it has helped to educate the public about New Zealand art. In that regard, I think it is an important collection as part of the picture of the maturing of the visual art scene in New Zealand. It very much is a snapshot in history.
to a large extent public collections weren't funded, as well as the Bank of New Zealand was able to fund the purchase of art in the 1980s, so they don't have that bandwidth that the art collection for the Bank of New Zealand does have. So I think it's a very unique and remarkable collection for that.
In some of the early press we did when we announced this collection, I referred to this sale as being the equivalent of, say, the Auckland Art Gallery swinging open the doors to its storeroom and saying, who's the highest bidder? Everything's for sale. I felt a little self-conscious about having said that afterwards, but really that is quite literally the quality of the works here, and that is why this is so significant.
The BNZ collection is really a tangible reflection of Peter McLeavey's legacy. You know, it's a body of work that he amassed over a short period of time, but it's largely, stayed together for, 40 years. And today we can look at it and reflect upon McLeavey's role in the development of New Zealand art, the support of New Zealand artists, and also his really astute eye.
It includes some of the greatest works by many of the nation's finest artists, ensuring that it will live on as the works move into new collections with fresh mandates. No doubt these collections will proudly claim the heritage of these works, once held in BNZ's esteemed collection. The legacy of the BNZ Art Collection will continue as the artworks move on to their next generation of custodians.
There's been shows of the BNZ collection, there's a book on the BNZ collection, and now there's an auction of the BNZ collection. So we're very, very aware of all these works in conversation with one another as part of the collection. After the sale, all those individual works are going to have a new life, and they're going to be in conversation with other things.
And it's become the responsibility of individual New Zealanders out there to be the custodians of the works for the future. And that's why it's so significant. It's something that I never thought I'd get to be a part of. And it's something that probably a lot of collectors never would have seen that they'd get to be a part of. But it's something that we're all a part of.
There's a real story being told here with these works. There's a legacy and a history. Many of the works that have come to us back to Webb's were initially purchased at auction and have the original Webb stickers from the time on the back. So we continue that legacy. Perhaps in the future they may come back again, but it's nice to see the influence, I suppose, that Peter Webb also had on building this collection.
The proceeds from the sale are going to go into philanthropic enterprises which will help people. I can't think of a better thing for me to think about as a legacy of my work, that someone collected it, paid me very little for it, sell it for a lot more, and that profit doesn't just disappear into the Bahamas, but actually gets ploughed back into philanthropic work in our own culture. That seems like a very noble way of completing their journey.
All of these works will always be from this collection. That'll always be part of their narrative. And selling this collection at auction like this is really interesting because it's asking New Zealanders to put their hand up and really show how serious they are about looking after the artwork for generations to come.
It has been an honour for Webb's to represent this collection and present it to the nation. Kua whai wāhi tēnei kohi-kohinga toi a te pēki o Aotearoa ki te whakawhanaketanga o ngā mahi toi a tātai I roto I Aotearoa. Ka pēnei tonu te whai wāhitanga me te whakaohotanga o wēnei toi ki ngā reanga e whai ake nei. Nō mātou a Webb's te honore ki te whakātu I tēnei kohi-kohinga. Kia whai wāhi ai te motu whānui ki te tiro atu ki wēnei a tātou toi rongonui a Aotearoa.